This is Progress and Poverty, page 173, chapter 3, of Interest and the Cause of Interest. Having made sure of the law of rent, we have obtained as its necessary corollary the law of wages, where the division is between rent and wages, and the law of wages and interest taken together, where the division is between the three factors. What proportion of the produce is taken as rent must determine what proportion is left for wages. If but land and labor are concerned, or to be divided between wages and interest if capital joins in the production. But without reference to this deduction, let us seek each of these laws separately and independently. If, when obtained in this way, we find that they correlate, our conclusions will have the highest certainty. And inasmuch as the discovery of the law of wages is the ultimate purpose of our inquiry, let us take up first the subject of interest. I have already referred to the difference in meaning between the terms profits and interest. It may be worthwhile further to say that interest, as an abstract term in the distribution of wealth, differs in meaning from the word as commonly used in this, that it includes all returns. Shut up. Stop! Shut up! Shut up! No idea where I even was. Stop! I have already referred to the difference in meaning between the terms profit and interest. It may be worthwhile further to say that interest as an abstract term in the distribution of wealth differs in meaning from the word as commonly used in this, that it includes all returns for the use of capital, and not merely those that pass from borrower to lender, and that it excludes compensation for risk, which forms so great a part of what is commonly called interest. Compensation for risk is evidently only an equalization of return between different employments of capital. What we want to find is what fixes the general rate of interest proper. The different rates of compensation for risk added to this will give the current rates of commercial interest. Now, it is evident that the greatest differences in what is ordinarily called interest are due to differences in risk. But it is also evident that between different countries and different times, there are also considerable variation in the rate of interest proper. In California, at one time, 2% a month. 2%? % a month would not have been considered extravagant interest on security on which loans could now be affected at 7 or 8% per annum, and through some part of the difference may be due to an increased sense of general stability. The greater part is evidently due to some other general cause. In the United States, generally, the rate of interest has been higher than in England, and in the newer states of the Union, higher than in the older states. The tendency of interest to sink as society progresses is well marked and has long been noticed. What is the law which will bind all these variations together and exhibit their cause? It is not worthwhile to dwell more than has hitherto incidentally been done upon the failure of the current political economy to determine the true law of interest. Its speculations upon this subject have not the definiteness and coherency which have enabled the accepted doctrine of wages to withstand the evidence of fact, and do not require the same elaborate review. that they run counter to the facts is evident. That interest does not depend on the productiveness of labor and capital is proved by the general fact that where labor and capital are most productive, interest is lowest. That it does not depend reversely upon wages or the cost of labor, lowering as wages rise and increasing as wages fall, is proved by the general fact that interest is high when and where wages are high and low when and where wages are low. Let us begin at the beginning. The nature and function of capital have already been sufficiently shown, but even at the at the risk of something like a digression, let us endeavor to ascertain the cause of interest before considering its law. For in addition to aiding in our inquiry by giving us a firmer and clearer grasp of the subject now in hand, it may lead to conclusions whose practical importance will be hereafter apparent. What is the reason and justification of interest? Why should the borrower pay back to the lender more than he received? These questions are worth answering, not merely from their speculative, but from their practical importance. The feeling that interest is the robbery of industry is widespread and growing, and on both sides of the Atlantic shows itself more and more in popular literature and in popular movements. The expounders of the current political economy say that there is no conflict between labor and capital, and oppose as injurious to labor as well as to capital all schemes for restricting the reward which capital obtains. Yet in the same works, the doctrine is laid down that wages and interest bear to each other an inverse relation, and that interest will be low or high as wages are high or low. Then there's an asterisk, and it says, this is really said of profits, but with the evident meaning of returns to capital. Anyway, clearly then, if this doctrine is correct, the only objection that from the standpoint of the laborer can be logically made to any scheme for the reduction of interest is that it will not work, which is manifestly very weak ground, while ideas of the omnipotence of legislatures are yet so widespread, and though such an objection may lead to the abandonment of any one particular scheme, it will not prevent the search for another. Why should interest be? Interest, we are told, in all the standard works, is the reward of abstinence, but manifestly it does not sufficiently account for it. Abstinence is not an active but a passive quality. It is not a doing, it is simply a not doing. Abstinence in itself produces nothing. Why then should any part of what is produced be claimed for it? If I have a sum of money which I lock up for a year, I have exercised as much abstinence as though I had loaned it. Yet though in the latter case I will expect it to be returned to me with an additional sum by way of interest, in the former I will have but the same sum and no increase. But the abstinence is the same. If it be said that in lending it I do the borrower a service, it may be replied that he also does me a service in keeping it safely, a service that under some conditions may be very valuable and for which I would willingly pay rather than not have it, and a service which, as to some forms of capital, may be even more obvious than as to money. For there are many forms of capital which will not keep, but must be constantly renewed, and many which are onerous to maintain if one has no immediate use for them. So if the accumulator of capital helps the user of capital by loaning it to him, does not the user discharge the debt in full when he hands it back? Is not the secure preservation, the maintenance, the recreation of capital as a complete offset to the use? Accumulation is the end and aim of abstinence. Abstinence can go no further and accomplish no more, nor of itself can it even do this. If we were merely to abstain from using it, how much wealth would disappear in a year? And how little would be left at the end of 2 years? Hence, if more is demanded for abstinence than the safe return of capital, is not labor wronged? Such ideas as these underlie the widespread opinion that interest can accrue only at the expense of labor, and is in fact a robbery of labor, which in a social condition based on justice would be abolished. The attempts to refute these views do not appear to me always successful. For instance, as it illustrates the unusual reasoning, take Bostadt's oft-quoted illustration of the plane. One carpenter, James, at the expense of 10 days' labor, make himself a plane which will last in use for 290 of the 300 working days of the year. William, another carpenter, proposes to borrow the plane for a year, offering to give it back at the end of that time with the plane when the plane will be worn out, a new plane equally as good. Oh, okay, so William's going to give James a new plane at the end of the year, not the worn out one. Okay. James objects to lending the plane on these terms, urging that if he merely gets back a plane, he will have nothing to compensate him for the loss of the advantage which the use of the plane during that year would give him. William, admitting to this, agrees not merely to return a plane, but in addition to give James a new plank. The agreement is carried out to mutual satisfaction. The plane is used up during the year, but at the end of the year, James receives as good a one and a plank in addition. He lends the new plane again and again until finally it passes into the hands of his son, who still continues to lend it, receiving a plank each time. This plank, which represents interest, is said to be a natural and equitable remuneration, as by giving it in return for the use of the plane, William, quote, obtains the power which exists in the tool to increase the productiveness of labor, end quote, and is no worse off than he would have been had he not borrowed the plane, while James obtains no more than he would have if he had retained and used the plane instead of lending it. Is this really so? It will be observed that it is not affirmed that James could make the plane and William could not, for that would be to make the plank and reward of superior skill. It is only that James had abstained from consuming the result of his labor until he had accumulated it in the form of a plane, which is the essential idea of capital. Now, if James had not lent the plane, he could have used it for 290 days, when it would have been worn out, and he would have been obliged to take the remaining 10 days of the working year to make a new plane. If William had not borrowed the plane, he would have taken 10 days to make himself a plane, which he could have used for the remaining 290 days. Thus, if we take a plank to represent the fruits of a day's labor with the aid of a plane, at the end of the year, had no borrowing taken place, each would have stood with reference to the plane as he commenced, James with a plane and William with none, and each would have had the result of the year's work, 290 planks. If the condition of the borrowing had been what William first proposed, thus, if we take a plank to represent the fruits of a day's labor with the aid of a plane, at the end of the year, had no borrowing taken place, each would have stood with reference to the plane as he commenced, James with a plane and William with none, and each would have had, as the result of the year's work, 290 planks. If the condition of the borrowing had been what William first proposed, the return of a new plane, the same relative situation would have been secured. William would have worked for 290 days and taken the last 10 days to make the new plane to return to James. James would have taken the first 10 days of the year to make another plane, which would have lasted for 290 days, when he would have received a new plane from William. Thus, the simple return of the plane would have put each in the same position at the end of the year as if no borrowing had taken place. James would have lost nothing to the gain of William, and William would have gained nothing to the loss of James. Each would have had the return his labor would otherwise have yielded, viz. 290 planks, and James would have had the advantage with which he started, a new plane. But when, in addition to the return of the plane, a plank is given, James, at the end of the year, will be in a better position if there had been no borrowing, and William in a worse. James will have 291 planks and a new plane, and William will have 289 planks and no plane. If William now borrows the plank as well as the plane on the same terms as before, he will at the end of the year have to return to James a plane, 2 planks, and a fraction of a plank. And if this difference be again borrowed, and so on, is it not evident that the income of one will progressively decline, and that the other will progressively increase until at length, if the operation be continued, the time will come when, as the result of the original lending of a plane, James will obtain the whole result of William's labor. That is to say, William will become virtually his slave. Is interest, then, natural and equitable? There is nothing in this illustration to show it to be. Evidently, what Bastiat and many others assigns as the basis of interest, quote, the power which exists in the tool to increase the productiveness of labor, end quote, is neither in justice nor in fact the basis of interest. The fallacy which makes Bastiat's illustration pass as conclusive with those who do not stop to analyze it, as we have done, is that with the loan of the plane they associate the transfer of the increased productive power which a plane gives to labor. But this is really not involved. The essential thing which James loaned to William was not the increased power which labor acquires from using planes. To suppose this, we should have to suppose that the making and using of planes was a trade secret or patent right, when the illustration would become one of monopoly, not of capital. The essential thing which James loaned to William was not the privilege of applying his labor in a more effective way, but the use of the concrete result of 10 days' labor. If the power which exists in the tools to increase the productiveness of labor were the cause of interest, then the rate of interest would increase with the march of invention. This is not so. Nor yet will I be expected to pay more interest if I borrow a $50 sewing machine than if I borrow $50 worth of needles? If I borrow a steam engine than if I borrow a pile of bricks of equal value? Capital, like wealth, is interchangeable. It is not one thing. It is anything to that value within the circle of exchange. Nor yet does the improvement of tools add to the reproductive power of capital. It adds to the productive power of labor. And I am inclined to think that if all wealth consisted of such things as planes, and all production was such as that of carpenters, that is to say, if wealth consisted but of the inherent matter of the universe, and production of working up this inert matter into different shapes, that interest would be but the robbery of industry, and could no longer exist. This is not to say that there would be no accumulation, for though the hope of increase is a motive for turning wealth into capital, it is not the motive, or at least not the main motive, for accumulating. Children will save their pennies for Christmas. Pirates will add to their buried treasure, and men like Stuart or Vanderbilt, having become once possessed of the passion of accumulating, would continue as long as they could to add to their millions, even though accumulation brought no increase. Nor yet is it to say that there would be no borrowing or lending, for this, to a large extent, would be prompted by mutual convenience. If William had a job of work to be immediately begun, and James one that would not commence until 10 days thereafter, there might be a mutual advantage in the loan of the plane, though no plank should be given. But all wealth is not the nature of planes, or planks, or money, which has no reproductive power, nor is all production merely the turning into other forms of this inert matter of the universe. It is true that if I put away money, it will not increase. But suppose instead I put away wine. At the end of a year, I will have an increased value, for the wine will have improved in quality. Or supposing that I went to a country adapted to more swarms of bees and the honey which they have made. Okay, or supposing that I went to a country adapted to them, I set out bees. At the end of the year, I will have more swarms of bees and the honey which they have made. Or supposing where there is a range, I turn out sheep or hogs or cattle. At the end of the year, I will upon average also have an increase. Now, what gives the increase in these cases is something which, though it generally requires labor to utilize it, is yet distinct and separable from labor. The active power of nature and the principle of growth, of reproduction, which everywhere characterizes all the forms of that mysterious thing or condition which we call life. And it seems to me that it is this which is the cause of interest, or the increase of capital over and above that due to labor. There are, so to speak, in the movements which make up the everlasting flux of nature, certain vital currents which will, if we use them, aid us with the force independent of our own efforts in turning matter into the forms we desire, that is to say, into wealth. I'm stopping at the middle of page 181 because I is swimming. So 181.